Emmy Harrison had 40 seconds before her daughter crossed that dining room and ended both their lives. Her hand was already moving, tray balanced, champagne flute steady, the professional stillness she had spent 2 years perfecting, when she saw Zoey come through the kitchen door in her scuffed sneakers, head up, deliberate, walking like she had somewhere to be. She did. She just didn't know what it would cost them. Around her, the latte lotus hummed with the particular frequency of serious money, crystal against silver, laughter kept deliberately low, jazz so soft it felt like a secret. Table 1 sat at the far end of the room, back protected, sight lines open, and Leroy Perkins occupied it the way weather occupies a landscape. Beside him, Diana Voss laughed at something he'd said. Emmy had heard something in the alley 20 minutes ago. Enough to know tonight was not an ordinary night. She had been moving toward table 1, tray up, expression neutral, the way she moved through every room that had never once looked at her, when the kitchen door swung open behind her. Small sneakers squeaked on marble. Zoey had her chin up and her eyes fixed on table 1 like she had been aimed there. 7 years old, 42 pounds, crossing the most expensive dining room in New York like she owned it. Emmy moved. She was fast. She had spent 2 years navigating this floor in heels without spilling a drop, and she crossed it in seconds, hand outstretched. 1 second too late. Zoey reached table 1. She rose on her tiptoes. She placed her small hand on the sleeve of Leroy Perkins' charcoal suit, and she whispered everything she had heard directly into his ear. The world at table 1 went absolutely still. He looked at the child. Then he looked at Emmy. His hand moved beneath the table, not for a weapon. For his phone. Diana Voss set down her wine glass with a careful, controlled click that said her hand was shaking. Emmy stood there, tray in hand, in her server's uniform, her palm on her daughter's shoulder, staring at the most dangerous man in New York as his expression confirmed that everything Zoey had said was true. Her old life ended there. Not with anything dramatic but with the small warm weight of a 7-year-old's hand on a dangerous man's sleeve, and a room full of people who had spent 2 years looking straight through Emmy Harrison suddenly, all at once, looking at nothing else. 11 minutes earlier, the back office smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet, and Zoey had eaten all her crackers. She had tried staying put. She had arranged the crackers by size, eaten them smallest to largest, counted the water stains on the ceiling tiles, 11, though one might have been a shadow, and listened to the muffled jazz seeping through the wall like something trapped. She had done everything her mother asked. She had been very invisible. And now she needed the bathroom, and the bathroom was down the hall, and the hall had a door to the alley, and the door was already open a crack, leaking cold air and the smell of the city. She only meant to go as far as the alley. The night outside was sharp and dark, the kind of cold that bites the ears first. The alley ran between the restaurant's rear wall and the concrete shoulder of the building next door, lit by a single yellow light above the service door. Zoey stepped out in her sneakers and her fleece and moved toward the far end, away from the light, the way her mother had always taught her, don't make yourself a problem for other people. She almost didn't notice the men. 4 of them stood in the deeper shadow near the loading dock, close together, speaking low. She registered them the way she registered most adult things, as furniture, as background, as not her business. They registered her the same way. A small girl in a fleece. Nothing. Zoey stayed quiet and she listened, because Zoey always listened. She didn't understand the language. It moved fast and clipped, sharp at the edges, and she caught none of the words except the ones in English, which came in short bursts between the rest like rocks in a current. Table 1. A time, she knew numbers. Position. And then one word she knew from the fairy tales her mother read her, from the movies, from the way grown-ups said it when they were being romantic and serious at the same time. Fiancée. She didn't understand the shape of what she was hearing. She was 7. She understood pieces, a table, a time, a woman, something that was going to happen tonight. She understood the tone, the particular low register of adults saying things they didn't want overheard, and she understood that it was about the restaurant she had just come from. About someone inside it. She thought about the man at table 1. She had seen him through the kitchen porthole earlier, while her mother was plating desserts. He had been sitting very still, not eating, looking at nothing. He had looked the way her mother sometimes looked after a long shift, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Like someone who needed someone to notice. Zoey decided, in the simple and total way that 7-year-olds decide things, that she was going to tell him. She straightened her fleece and went back inside. Leroy Perkins had survived 17 years at the top of New York's most dangerous empire by learning to read rooms. He knew when a conversation was a test. He knew when a smile was a weapon. He knew, before any of his men did, when the temperature of a space had changed. He did not know that the temperature was about to be changed by a 7-year-old in a fleece jacket. He had been watching Diana laugh. He had been doing that a lot lately, watching her, the way you watch something you are not entirely sure you have correctly identified. She was beautiful. She was composed. She said the right things in the right rooms and wore the right things to the right tables and laughed at exactly the right volume. He had chosen her with the same methodology he applied to everything: assess, evaluate, acquire. He had not asked himself whether he loved her. That had not seemed like the relevant question. Tonight something was wrong with her laugh. It arrived half a beat late, like a translation. He was still turning that over when he felt it, a small hand on his sleeve. Not the tentative touch of someone asking for something. A deliberate touch. The touch of someone who had decided. He looked down. The child was looking straight at him. Not at his suit, not at the table, not at the candles or the crystal or any of the things adults use to orient themselves in expensive rooms. At him. She had serious eyes, dark and steady, and she rose on her tiptoes with the focused gravity of someone delivering news they understood was important even if they didn't understand all of it. She whispered into his ear. He went still. Not the performed stillness he used in negotiations, the stillness that was actually a kind of pressure. This was different. This was the stillness of a man whose entire internal architecture had just rearranged itself around a single point of information. He heard the words. Table 1. The glass wall. Position. A time. Fiancée. The child's voice was careful, methodical, repeating what she had memorized the way children repeat things they know matter, completely, in order, without editorializing. When she finished, he did not move for 2 full seconds. Then he looked up. The waitress was standing 3 feet away, her tray held against her chest, her face doing something complicated, terror and apology and the particular helplessness of a mother who has just watched her child walk off a ledge she couldn't reach in time. She was black, early 30s, wearing the restaurant's white uniform with the focused economy of someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as the job required and not 1 inch more. She had been serving this room for 2 years. He had never once looked at her face. He looked at it now. Then he looked at Diana. Diana had not moved. She was still smiling, still angled toward him, still performing the easy intimacy of a woman in love. But her hand had found her wine glass, and her grip on it was wrong, knuckles just slightly too pale, fingers just slightly too rigid. A woman holding something breakable because it was the only thing available to hold. She already knew. The understanding arrived in Leroy's chest like something cold and heavy, not quite grief, not quite anger, but the specific weight of a thing you suspected and refused to believe until the moment you could no longer afford not to. He did not look at her again. He reached beneath the table, unhurried, invisible to the room, and pressed a single button on his phone. Across the dining room, his head of security Dante looked up from the bar. Leroy moved his eyes once toward the door. Dante straightened, set down his glass, and touched his earpiece. The jazz played on. The crystal caught the candlelight. Around them the latte lotus continued its beautiful, indifferent hum, full of people who had no idea that the most dangerous man in the room had just been saved by a child who didn't fully understand what she had saved him from. Leroy looked back at the waitress. She hadn't moved. She had one hand on her daughter's shoulder, and she was watching him with the careful attention of a woman calculating whether she had just made the best or worst decision of her life. He made his decision in the same moment she made hers. "Stay close," he said. He said it quietly, the way he said everything, not a request, not quite an order, but something in the register between the two that left very little room for argument. "Both of you." And Harrison looked at him for one long second. Then she pulled her daughter closer and stayed. The power cut at 9:47. One moment the latte lotus was glittering, all candlelight and crystal and the warm expensive hum of a room full of people who believed themselves safe, and the next it was dark, and in the dark the room became something else entirely. Chairs scraped. A woman gasped. Someone's wine glass went over, and the sound of it hitting marble was very loud in the sudden silence where the jazz had been. Dante was already moving. He came through the dining room in 4 long strides, clearing a path with his body and the particular authority of a man who does not ask people to move so much as make them aware that moving is their best available option. 2 of Leroy's men materialized from the edges of the room. Emmy had not even registered them as his men until this moment, had catalogued them as ordinary diners, which told her something about how good they were, and formed a loose perimeter around table 1. "Kitchen," Dante said. One word, directed at Leroy, who was already on his feet. They moved. Emmy grabbed Zoey's hand and moved with them because the alternative was standing still in a darkened room with 4 armed men she couldn't see, and Emmy Harrison had not survived 3 years of impossible choices by being slow. Zoey, for once, did not argue. The kitchen was all harsh emergency lighting and startled staff, cooks pressing themselves against stainless steel counters, a busboy frozen in the act of carrying a stack of plates that he seemed to have forgotten he was holding. Diana was with them. She had moved when Leroy moved, without being told, with the precise economy of a woman who had been waiting for a signal she already understood. Dante swept the room with a look and moved toward the rear exit. He stopped. Emmy heard it before she understood it, a shift in the quality of the silence outside the door, the particular held-breath stillness of people waiting. Dante turned back without opening it. His expression said everything his voice didn't. "Covered," he said. Leroy looked at the room. Emmy watched him do it, the rapid, comprehensive scan of a man cataloging options and discarding them faster than most people could identify them. His eyes moved across the kitchen staff, the counters, the 2 exits, and then, with a quality of reluctant assessment, to Emmy. "Another way out," he said. "Loading dock off the alley," she said immediately. But they were already in the alley when she stopped. "Rerouted. Service corridor runs along the north wall. Comes out on 53rd, between the building and the parking structure. Management uses it for supplier deliveries. There's a door at the end that's supposed to be locked, but the latch has been broken for 8 months and nobody's fixed it. Leroy looked at her. I filed the maintenance request myself, she said. Twice. Something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile. Lead, he said. She led. The service corridor was narrow and unlit and smelled like old cardboard and recycled air, and she moved through it with her hand on the wall and Zoey tucked tight against her side and the sound of the others following at her back, Leroy, Dante, 2 of his men, and Diana, her heels silent on the concrete in a way that suggested she had made a deliberate choice about noise. At the far end the broken door opened onto 53rd Street exactly as she had said it would, spilling them into the cold and the orange glow of the parking structure across the street. Her car was where she'd left it. 3rd row, 2nd space. A 2009 Civic the color of old pewter, with a cracked left taillight, a front bumper held on with 2 bolts and a piece of wire she had twisted on herself in the parking lot of Zoey's last specialist appointment, and a pine tree air freshener hanging from the mirror that had stopped smelling like pine approximately 2 years ago. Leroy Perkins looked at it. She watched him take it in, the rust along the wheel well, the inspection sticker from 14 months ago, the passenger side window that didn't roll all the way down. She had spent 2 years being invisible in rooms built to make her feel like nothing. She was used to the particular expression people wore when they finally saw the shape of her real life and couldn't quite hide their reaction. His face did something she didn't expect. It went quiet. Not with disdain. With something closer to recognition. This is the car, he said. This is the car, she said. He looked at her once more, with the direct, measuring attention she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things he considered important, and walked to the passenger side. Then drive, he said. Dante folded himself into the back beside Leroy. Diana got into the front passenger seat quickly, her diamond earrings catching the orange light of the parking structure for just a moment before the door closed. Emmy buckled Zoey into the middle seat from memory, her hands moving on autopilot, and got behind the wheel. The Civic started on the first turn of the key, because it always did. It was old and it was ugly and it had never once let her down, and she pulled out of the lot onto 53rd with her hands steady and her jaw set in the quiet, absolute knowledge that her old life was already several blocks behind her. Zoey, wedged between 2 of the most dangerous men in New York, looked up at Dante with frank curiosity. Your suit has a tear in it, she said. Dante looked down. Then he looked at Leroy. A block passed in silence. Then Leroy said, without turning from the window, why do you bring her to work? Emmy kept her eyes on the road. It was not a question she had been asked before, not directly, not by anyone who actually wanted the answer. She's sick, she said. Has been for 2 years. She needs to be monitored every day, medication on a schedule, someone who knows what to watch for. A nanny, he said. A nanny costs money, Emmy said. The words came out flat, not bitter. She had long since passed the stage where saying true things out loud required any particular effort. The specialists cost money. The medication costs money. The job pays for all of it, but only if I show up, and if I show up I have to bring her, because there is no one else and there has not been anyone else for 3 years. She changed lanes. So I bring her. I find a back office and I tell her to stay invisible and mostly she does. Mostly, Zoey said, from the back seat, in a tone that suggested she considered this a reasonable track record. Leroy looked out the window at New York sliding past in the dark. Something in his expression had settled into a quality Emmy could not name, not pity, which she would have recognized and resented. Something quieter. The look of a man recalculating the weight of what he was carrying in the back of a rusted Civic, and finding it heavier than he had assumed. "Drive," he said again. And this time it didn't sound like a command. It sounded like a man who had run out of other options and was, for the first time in a very long time, simply trusting someone else to know the way. The building on 52nd had no signage, no doorman, and a lobby that looked from the outside like a mid-tier corporate address, the kind of building that exists specifically to not be looked at. Inside, it was something else. Reinforced doors that required a code and a handprint. Private elevators that opened only with a key card that Dante produced from somewhere without being asked. Men in dark clothing who materialized at intervals along the corridor with the quiet efficiency of people who had been waiting to materialize, and who regarded Emmy and Zoey with the careful neutrality of professionals assessing a variable they had not been briefed on. Zoey looked at all of it with wide, methodical eyes, storing everything, saying nothing. It was the most restrained and had ever seen her. The apartment, if it could be called that, occupied the top floor and had been designed for exactly one purpose, to be impossible to leave without permission and impossible to enter without dying. Floor-to-ceiling windows on three sides, the city spread out below like a circuit board lit from within. Furniture that was expensive and impersonal, the furniture of a place that was a function rather than a home. Three men positioned at the windows before Leroy had crossed the threshold. A fourth appeared from a back room, exchanged 4 words with Dante in a voice too low to catch, and disappeared again. A woman in dark clothing and no visible emotion materialized beside Emmy. "The child," she said, not unkindly. "There's a room prepared. Doctor is on his way." Emmy's hand tightened on Zoe's shoulder. "I don't know you." "No." The woman looked at Leroy. He gave a single nod, small, decisive. The woman looked back at Emmy with something that might, in another light, have been patience. "My name is Sue. I've worked for Mr. Perkins for 11 years. Your daughter is sick. The doctor who is coming has treated 3 of the people in this building at various points and none of them have died of his care. The room has a lock and you have the only key." She held it out. Emmy looked at the key. She looked at Zoey. Zoey was looking at Sue with the evaluating attention she gave to most adults she'd just met, the look that meant she was running some internal calculation that Emmy had never fully been able to decode. "She has medicine in my bag," Emmy said. "The blue zippered pocket. Half a tablet at 9, with food, not without." Sue nodded once, as if this were simply information to be processed and acted on, and that simple nod, its professionalism, its lack of drama, loosened something small and rigid in Emmy's chest. She crouched down to Zoe's level. Zoey looked at her with those steady dark eyes. "I'll be right outside," Emmy said. "I know," Zoey said, with the magnificent and slightly infuriating confidence of a child who has never once doubted her mother. Emmy watched her go. She watched the door close. She looked at the key in her hand for a long moment, then closed her fingers around it and turned back to the room. Leroy was standing at the window with his back to her, his silhouette set against the city's cold light. Without turning, he said, "Sit down." "I'd rather stand." "So would I." He turned. "Sit down anyway. What I'm about to tell you will be easier if you're not holding yourself up." She sat. He told her about Marcus Cole in the flat, economical way he seemed to tell all things, not edited for her comfort, not dramatized, just the shape of it, the right hand who had stolen, the exile, the 2 years of silence, the Korean syndicate Marcus had built his second life inside. He told her that the operation tonight had not been improvised. It had been months in the planning. He told her, with a directness she was beginning to recognize as his version of respect, that she and Zoey had been seen exiting the alley, and that the people who had been in that alley were now looking for them. She absorbed all of it without speaking. When he finished, she said, "I want to go home." "I know. You can't keep me here." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "I can't keep you. But I can keep your daughter alive. The door between those two things is you." The words landed precisely, which she suspected was intentional. She looked at this man, his stillness, his weight, the particular quality of his attention, which was like being examined by something that had learned to see through surfaces, and understood that he was not threatening her. He was telling her the truth. There was a difference, and she had spent enough years in rooms full of powerful people to know the shape of it. "What do you need from me?" she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief, he didn't seem like a man who felt relief, but something adjacent to it. The slight recalibration of someone whose calculation has been confirmed. "Everything you remember," he said. "Starting from the moment you walked into that alley." She started from the beginning. She told him everything, and he listened the way she had listened in the alley, completely, without moving, storing all of it, and for the first time in 2 years in that building, Emmy Harrison felt, strangely and against all reason, like the most important person in the room. Diana Voss did not look like a woman who had spent the last 4 months trying to save a man's life without him knowing. She looked, as she had always looked, composed. She sat in the chair across from Leroy with her hands folded in her lap and her diamond earrings catching the overhead light, and she met his eyes with the directness of someone who has decided that the time for performance is over. She had asked, upon arriving, for water. Not wine. Water. Emmy had noted that. Emmy was standing near the wall, positioned there by Dante with a gesture that was not quite a direction and not quite a suggestion, and she had stayed because leaving the room felt more dangerous than remaining in it, and because some part of her, the part that had spent 2 years reading people who didn't know they were being read, understood that what was about to happen in this room was something she needed to witness. Leroy sat across from Diana and said nothing. He was very good at nothing. He made it into a kind of pressure, a sustained, patient silence that most people cracked inside of 30 seconds because it felt like being waited for in a way that was impossible to outlast. Diana lasted 40. "He found me 3 years ago," she said. "Before us. Before the engagement. When I was still no one you'd heard of." Her voice was steady in the way things are steady when they have been practiced into steadiness. "My name wasn't always Diana Voss. Before that, I was someone else, in another city, and that person did something that could not be undone and could never be attached to who I had become." She paused. "Marcus found the record. He found the name. He came to me 6 months after we got engaged and he gave me a choice." Leroy had not moved. His face was completely still in the way it had been still when Zoey whispered in his ear, the stillness of internal rearrangement. "Help him dismantle you," Diana said, "or watch everything I'd built get burned to the ground before it." She looked down at her folded hands. "I chose survival. I have been choosing it my whole life. It's the only thing I've ever been reliable at." "And the plan," Leroy said. "I was inside it," she said. "I had to be inside it to break it. I moved the date twice, told Marcus the reservation changed. I adjusted the seating so you wouldn't be against the glass. I told him the security rotation was different from what it was." She looked up. "I have been dismantling his plan from the inside for 4 months. Every piece I could reach without him knowing I was reaching." She glanced at Emmy for the first time, a quick, direct look, one woman reading another. The night ran out before I found a way to stop it cleanly. I needed someone on the outside to do what I couldn't do from inside. The room was very quiet. Emmy said, before she could stop herself, "Why didn't you just tell him?" Diana looked at her fully now. There was no hostility in it. There was the recognition of a question she had asked herself 1,000 times. Because Marcus had people watching me. Because the first deviation he couldn't explain, he would have released the file. Because I was trying to save Leroy's life without destroying my own in the process. She paused. Because I was afraid, and fear makes cowards of people who should know better. Emmy understood that. She understood it in her spine, in the specific ache of 3 years of making herself small to stay safe. She looked at Diana Voss, this composed, frightened, methodical woman who had spent 4 months quietly trying to save the man she loved without letting him see the shape of the trap she was caught in, and believed her. Leroy had not spoken. He was looking at Diana with the expression of a man sorting through a very large and complex thing that had landed on him without warning. "The secret," he said finally. "What you did. What you were." Diana held his eyes. "Does it matter?" A long silence. "It matters," he said, "that you tell me. Not to anyone else. To me." Diana looked at him for a moment in which something crossed her face that was too private to name, relief and grief and the particular vulnerability of a person removing the last layer of armor they have. She told him. Emmy looked at the window. She did not need to hear it. She had already heard enough. The kitchen at the 52nd Street property was the size of Emmy's entire apartment, which she noted with the flat, unsentimental accounting she applied to all such comparisons now. Marble counters. A range that had probably never been used for anything more demanding than reheating. A coffee machine that took her 4 minutes to figure out and produced, when she finally cracked it, the best coffee she had ever tasted in her life. She was on her 2nd cup when Leroy came in. He had changed from the Tom Ford suit into something darker and less architectural. He looked, in this light, more like a man and less like a statement. He helped himself to coffee without asking where anything was, the gesture of someone accustomed to spaces configuring themselves around him, and sat across from her at the kitchen island with a legal pad and a pen. "Start with what Zoey told you," he said. "As close to her exact words as you can." Emmy set down her cup. She had been organizing it in her head since the car, had done it the way she organized everything in her life, in sequence, with detail, without embellishment. She had learned a long time ago that if you were the one nobody was looking at, the only way to make your information count was to deliver it with a precision that left no room for dismissal. She told him. She gave him the timing in the order Zoey had given it to her, which was the order Zoey had heard it, stored with the fidelity of a child who had not yet learned that some things weren't worth remembering. She gave him the positions as Zoey had understood them, one at the bar, some by the kitchen, one near the window. She gave him the physical description of the man in charge, which Zoey had provided with the specific and accidental acuity of a child who notices the things adults have trained themselves not to: a scar below the left ear, a ring on the wrong hand, shoes that squeaked slightly on the wet concrete. Leroy was writing. He had not looked up. "The time she gave," he said. 9:45. The power went at 9:47. 2 minutes off, Emmy said. Either Zoey misheard, or they moved early. They moved early. He wrote something. Because of the whisper. They saw her at the table and they didn't know what she said, so they accelerated. He looked up for the first time. Your daughter cost them 2 minutes. 2 minutes is what got us to the corridor. Emmy absorbed that. She looked at her coffee cup. The man with the scar, Leroy said. Below the left ear. Zoey said the left. She knows her left from her right, we worked on it. Emmy paused. She also said his watch was too big for his wrist, like it belonged to someone else. Something sharpened in Leroy's expression. He wrote that down separately, circled it. You should have been in intelligence, he said. I'm in food service, she said. He looked at her with the same quality of attention he had turned on the situation from the beginning, comprehensive, unsentimental, honest. Same skill set, he said. Different application. It was such an exact echo of what she had thought in the alley, standing against the cold brick and listening, that it startled something open in her chest. She looked at him, this man who moved through the world as though gravity were a policy he had chosen to observe rather than a law imposed upon him, and thought, he sees it. Not the uniform. Not the single mother with the sick child and the cracked taillight. The part underneath that had always been there and had never once been named out loud. She looked away before the thought could become something she would have to account for. Marcus will move again, she said. He's not the kind of man who recalibrates. He's the kind of man who escalates. Yes. Then whatever you're planning, she said, you need to plan it fast. Leroy looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned the legal pad around and slid it across the marble counter toward her. On it was a diagram, the restaurant, the building, 3 possible entry points, a timeline. Clean and methodical, the architecture of a counteroffensive. Tell me what I'm missing, he said. Emmy pulled the pad closer. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, completely, carefully, with the accumulated attention of a woman who had spent years absorbing what the world didn't know she was absorbing. She picked up his pen and began to mark corrections. The message came through Dante at 11 the following morning, relayed through 2 intermediaries in the flat, clipped syntax of men who had learned to strip language of everything that could be used against them in a room where someone was listening. Marcus Cole knew about Emmy. Dante delivered it standing in the doorway of the room Emmy had been given, a clean, spare space with a window overlooking an interior courtyard, furnished with the impersonal efficiency of a place designed to house people temporarily. He told her what Marcus had sent, that he knew a woman had been in the alley. That he believed she had become Leroy's informant. That he was offering a choice, bring the woman to a meeting, location to be provided, or he would release Diana's buried history to every crime family currently watching New York's balance of power with sharpened attention. He would burn everything, Marcus promised, before he let Leroy rebuild. Emmy listened to all of it. When Dante finished, she looked at the window for a moment, at the small gray square of courtyard below, and then she said, "Is Zoey safe as long as Marcus is standing?" Dante looked at her steadily. He was not a man who softened answers. No. She nodded once. Then I'll go. The conversation with Leroy lasted 9 minutes, which was approximately 8.5 minutes longer than she had expected him to require before telling her it was not a viable option and that he had other means of addressing Marcus that did not involve sending a civilian into a meeting with a man who had ordered 2 confirmed assassinations in the past calendar year. She let him say all of it. Then she said, "He asked for me specifically. Which means the only person Marcus is willing to sit across from right now is someone he thinks he has leverage over. You don't qualify. Dante doesn't qualify. I do." She paused. "I'm also the only person in this building he has genuinely underestimated, which means I'm the only person who can walk into that room and have him believe he's in control of it." Leroy looked at her for a long time. "You've never done anything like this," he said. "I've worked doubles in a 4-star restaurant for 2 years," she said. I've been a person nobody looked at in rooms full of people trying very hard to be seen. I've managed a 7-year-old specialist schedule while working nights and fielding calls from debt collectors during my break. She met his eyes. I have been performing composure in situations that would break most people since before you knew my name existed. Tell me again what I haven't done. He said nothing for the full length of a silence that had weight and texture and a kind of honesty in it. Then, Dante will be 3 minutes behind you. There will be a recording device in the lining of your coat. You do not improvise. You do not deviate. You get what we need and you come out. I know, she said. If it goes wrong. It won't go wrong. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not assessment. Not calculation. Something older than either of those things, the look of a man watching someone walk toward a risk he cannot fully cover, and feeling the specific, unfamiliar weight of that. Emmy, he said. She paused. Come back, he said. It was 2 words. He said them the way he said everything, quietly, with no embellishment, in the register of a man who chose his words with the same care that other men chose their weapons. She held them for a moment, in the part of her chest that had been very carefully empty for a very long time. I intend to, she said. The meeting with Marcus Cole took place in a private dining room above a restaurant in Koreatown, all dark wood and low light and the smell of something expensive simmering in a kitchen she couldn't see. Marcus was smaller than she had expected, neatly made, precise in his movements, with the careful pleasantness of a man who had learned early that anger was a resource best kept in reserve. He offered her tea. She accepted it and did not drink it. He told her what he wanted in the flat, reasonable tone of a man discussing a transaction. He wanted Leroy's operational calendar for the next 90 days. He wanted the names of Leroy's current contacts in the Port Authority. He wanted Emmy to confirm, on record, in a statement he would have notarized, that she had witnessed Leroy ordering a retaliatory action against the Korean syndicate that could be characterized, in the right context and before the right audience, as an act of war. He was telling her this, he explained, because she was a single mother with a sick child and no particular loyalty to a man she had known for 48 hours, and also added a threat of coming after her kid if she refused what he asked. Emmy looked at him across the dark wood table and thought about Zoey's last medical bill. She thought about the cracked tail light and the broken door latch she had reported twice and the 2 years of carrying a dining room full of people who had never once looked at her face. She thought about what it felt like to be underestimated by every person in a room. She nodded slowly, like a woman who had been persuaded. She asked 3 clarifying questions, the questions of someone who needed to understand the terms before agreeing, and in asking them gave Dante, 3 minutes behind her and listening through the device in her coat lining, everything Leroy needed to confirm 3 things they had previously only theorized about Marcus Cole's operation. She left the restaurant 40 minutes later, walked 2 blocks, and got into the back of a car where Dante was waiting. Her hands were shaking. She had not let them shake for the full 40 minutes she was inside. She let them shake now, briefly, in the dark, and then she made them stop. Marcus released Diana's secret at midnight. Not because negotiations had failed. Not because a line had been crossed. He released it because men like Marcus Cole do not negotiate, they accumulate leverage and then they spend it, and the spending is the point, and the damage is the message. He sent the file to 4 crime family representatives simultaneously, with a cover note that was brief and precise and designed to do exactly one thing, make Leroy Perkins appear to be a man whose own house was too compromised to hold. 40 seconds later, the second wave of Korean enforcers entered the building on 52nd Street through the parking sublevel, which Marcus had known about because one of the men in Leroy's outer security ring had been Marcus's for 11 months, patiently waiting to be useful. Two things happened at the same time that Marcus had designed to happen sequentially. Leroy and Dante were already moving toward the parking level when Emmy's phone, the one Sue had given her 2 days ago, added to no list and registered to no name, vibrated once. Not a call. A text from Sue. 2 words, service corridor. Emmy was already out of bed. She had been in this building for 2 days and she had spent both of them doing what she had always done in every expensive room she'd ever been stationed in, she had found every exit. Not because she had been told to. Because she was a woman who had learned, at some point she could not precisely identify, that the people who told you where the exits were had different interests than the people who needed them. She knew the service corridor. She knew the secondary stairwell behind the laundry room on the 4th floor. She knew that the door at the base of that stairwell opened onto a maintenance alley that connected, via a gap in the fencing that someone had covered with a panel of sheet metal that was not actually secured to anything, onto a street that was not 52nd. She had Zoey up and dressed in 4 minutes, shoes on, coat on, medicine bag on Emmy's shoulder, and moving through the 4th floor corridor before the sound of anything concerning had reached that level. Zoey was silent and quick in the way she became silent and quick when she understood that silence and quickness were what the situation required, which was a quality Emmy had never explicitly taught her and suspected she had simply absorbed from years of watching her mother operate under pressure. The maintenance alley was cold and very dark. Emmy moved through it with Zoey's hand in hers and her shoulder against the wall for reference, counting her steps the way she had counted them twice in the daylight when she'd mapped this route in her head. The sheet metal panel moved on the first push. They came out onto the side street 2 minutes before the building's backup generator failed and the block went dark. Emmy pulled Zoey into the shadow of a delivery entrance and held her there, one arm around her shoulders, and looked up at the building they had just left and listened to the city rearrange itself around whatever was happening inside it. "Are you scared?" Zoey said. "Yes," Emmy said. Zoey considered that. "Me too," she said, in a tone that managed to be simultaneously honest and entirely unbothered. She leaned into Emmy's side. "But you always figure it out." Emmy held her daughter in the dark and did not say anything because there was nothing adequate to say. 3 blocks away, in the parking sublevel, Leroy met Marcus Cole's second wave. It was not a long encounter. Leroy had been operating in New York for 17 years and he had spent the last 48 hours receiving intelligence from a woman who did not miss things, and the wave that Marcus had believed was a surprise to no one except the men who comprised it. Dante handled the logistics. Leroy handled the conclusion. Above them, in a hotel bar 4 blocks away where she had been told to wait, Diana Voss received the file on her phone at the same moment every crime family representative in New York received it. She read it. She set down her phone. She ordered a drink she did not finish. And then she did the one thing Marcus Cole, in all his careful and patient planning, had not modeled for. She went to the window that overlooked the street, called the representative of the oldest crime family currently watching New York's balance of power, and told him who she was. Not who she had been. Who she was. She told him that Leroy Perkins had known her history and chosen her anyway, and that any man willing to be named before every power in New York on the basis of that choice was a man whose house was not compromised but fortified. She said it in the flat, unhysterical voice of a woman who has burned her last shelter and found, in the burning, that she is still standing. By the time Leroy reached the street, 3 of the 4 representatives had already made calls. The 4th sent a message directly to Marcus Cole, whose operation, exposed, overextended, and now publicly attributed, had nothing left to spend. Marcus was collected before morning. Leroy did not rush it. He had waited 2 years for the accounting, he could wait one more night to do it correctly. Emmy was still in the shadow of the delivery entrance when Sue found her at 1:20, with a car and 2 words, "It's done." Emmy looked at Zoey, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder with the sublime and total confidence of a child who had never doubted her mother would find the exits. She looked up at the sky over New York, winter black, indifferent, scattered with the cold light of a city that did not care and never had. She exhaled. She let it out completely, the whole long weight of it. Then she picked up her daughter and got in the car. 6 months later, Zoey's last scan came back clean. The doctor said the word remission carefully, the way doctors always said it, with a precision born of long experience watching hope become its own kind of wound, and Emmy heard it anyway as the sound of a door opening. She had been holding that door shut for 3 years, her whole weight against it, and now she let it open, just slightly, and stood in the light that came through. Zoey, for her part, received the news with the same equanimity she had brought to most of the significant events of the last 6 months. She asked if remission meant she could do cartwheels again, was told yes with some caveats she immediately stopped listening to, and was found 20 minutes later practicing them in the hallway outside the medical suite, her sneakers squeaking on the marble, leaving scuff marks that Emmy looked at and did not tell her to stop. The mansion, she had stopped calling it the property in her head sometime around the 2nd month, had become theirs in the way that homes become theirs, not through any formal declaration but through accumulation. Zoey's drawings covered the kitchen refrigerator in 3 overlapping layers, secured with an assortment of mismatched magnets she had selected with great seriousness from a tourist shop and that Leroy had not removed and had never, to Emmy's knowledge, so much as looked at with anything other than complete neutrality. There were scuff marks on the baseboard of the east corridor where Zoey had spent 2 weeks convinced she was on the verge of a breakthrough. There was a shelf in the library where Emmy had put her nursing textbooks, not prominently, not as a statement, just there, available, and where they had sat for 6 weeks before Leroy had asked about them with the particular directness he brought to all things, and she had told him. And he had said nothing at all, and then the following week there had been a name and a contact number on her desk for the admissions coordinator at Columbia's accelerated nursing program, placed there without comment and without ceremony. She had called the number. That was 4 months ago. She was registered for the fall. Diana ran the Perkins Group's legitimate holdings now, the restaurants, the real estate, the logistics infrastructure that had always been the empire's respectable face, with the focused efficiency of a woman who had spent years managing something far more complicated and found the relative simplicity of legal business almost restful. Her history was public. It had been public since the night she stood at a hotel window and made the phone call that cost her the last thing she had been hiding behind. The families who mattered had decided, one by one, that a woman willing to pay that price for the man she chose was a woman worth knowing. The families who hadn't mattered had, by the nature of their not mattering, ceased to be relevant. She and Emmy had not become friends, exactly. They had become something more specific and in some ways more durable, 2 women who had seen each other at the worst and the most honest, and who moved through shared space with the easy shorthand of people who did not need to explain themselves to each other. On a cold night in January, Emmy stood at the window of the room that had become hers and looked out over New York. The city was doing what it always did, continuing, indifferent, lit from within, vast and ungovernable and entirely unaware of the woman looking down at it. She had worked its floors for 2 years as someone it had no name for. She had driven through its streets in a rusted Civic with a borrowed child and a broken taillight, and she had saved a king with the only things she had, which turned out to be enough. She had stood in its alleys and its kitchens and its darkened corridors, and she had listened and remembered and found the exits, and she had come out the other side of something that should have buried her, and she was still here, at this window, looking out at a city that still didn't fully know what it was looking at. She heard him before she saw his reflection in the glass, the quiet particular weight of his footsteps, which she had memorized by the second week without intending to. Leroy came to stand beside her. They stood there in the way they had learned to stand, not touching, but close, the particular proximity of two people who had stopped needing to manage the distance between them. Outside, the city continued. A siren somewhere. The low constant roar of 10 million people going about their lives without knowing whose window they were living under. Regrets, he said. Emmy looked at the city. She thought about the alley, and the cracked taillight, and 11 minutes, and a child rising on her tiptoes to whisper the truth into the ear of a dangerous man because it was simply the right thing to do. She thought about the back office that smelled like industrial cleaner. She thought about 2 years of carrying a tray through a room full of people who had never once looked at her face. She thought about what it had cost to be invisible for so long, and what it had turned out to be worth, not despite the cost, but because of it, because everything she had filed away and absorbed and survived in the dark had been exactly the preparation she needed for the night it mattered. She thought about Zoey in the hallway, scuffing the baseboard, completely uncontainable, completely herself. Not one, she said. Outside, New York continued its cold and brilliant indifference. Inside, at its highest window, Emmy Harrison looked out over it and let herself be seen. Thank you for being here, please like and subscribe so you don't miss such intriguing stories like this. Goodbye.